We now get into the heart of the primer, issue 1, an introduction to information and communication technologies for development. I say that this is the heart of the primer because in the first section we had actually talked about basic concepts, about fundamentals that one needs to know about development, and then about information and communication technologies and their characteristics. In the second section, we had spent a great deal of time talking about the ways in which different countries have applied these ICTs to different development sectors, whether this has been basic sectors such as agriculture, education, health, or it has been in the area of sustainable development, or in fact in government, or the preservation of cultural diversity and of rural tourism. What all these experiences tell us is that as important as just using the ICTs and understanding their grammar, understanding the way in which they have worked, is also to get an understanding of how one manages an ICTD project. An ICTD project is different, although in many ways it is part of a larger development project. It is different, and therefore it is necessary for us to look at project management from a focus of ICTs for development. Thus, the basic learning objectives of this section, which consists of about 4 chapters and a conclusion, is essentially to give you an introduction to the issues and challenges in the implementation of ICTD programs and projects, to address the various key elements in each of these challenges, and to address the key challenges in the project management process itself, to understand the importance of change management in ICTD project management and the basics of what one might call ICTD project evaluation. After completing this session, we hope that you will be able to understand why ICTD projects are different from other development projects, understand why ICTD projects may succeed or they may fail, understand the importance of integrated planning as a process in ICTD projects, understand the elements of managing partnerships, time and people, because ICTD is all about people, and then apply the basics of ICTD project evaluation methodologies. I must begin by drawing your attention to some shocking statistics. That is, that over 90% of ICTD projects in the public sector are failing, and 70% is a conservative figure. In some countries, governments will argue in private conversations that up to 80% of projects fail. This means if 1 out of every 4 projects or 1 out of every 5 projects is succeeding, then we must understand why projects fail or why they succeed. Unfortunately, there are very few systematic assessments of success or failure. Nobody likes to report a failure, and therefore you will find very little documentation of the reasons for failure. Most of the time, from what case studies we do have and from what are available on the internet and what are available in publications, very often the technology works, but the project has failed. So the issues are not of technology, but essentially managerial and human in nature. So we must look at what some of these things are before we begin to understand how to apply the principles of project management to ICTD interventions. First of all, we have to understand that ICTD interventions are very different. Today, they work in a public space. That means government interventions or interventions made by well-meaning private sector or NGOs are not working in the closed room. They are working in communities, and therefore they are highly visible. And there is a hype surrounding them. Leaders of governments, policymakers, implementers, and even those of us who use ICTs in our daily lives, whether it is the mobile phone, believe somehow that these technologies have a great power. If they have a great power, it makes us all the more visible and all the more keen that they succeed and that they be used. When we succeed, it is publicly visible, it is recorded as a best case, it wins awards, and ICT intervention is recognized for the change it has made. When we fail, there is always the ever-present media who draw attention to our failures. There are always people who say that you spent all this money and yet we have not had any benefit. So, success and failure in ICT projects are publicly visible. All of us know in what ways the internet or mobile phones have changed our lives. Therefore, these technologies and the content that they carry has a widespread influence on society. That means some of the effects that they have may not be those that we had anticipated, that we had expected, and the influence that ICTs have on society goes from the very good to the very bad. Because there are so many different kinds of influences, we need to understand that these are different kinds of projects. And finally, ICT projects bring in teams of people, including IT engineers, software designers, application creators, content developers. So, they bring in a lot of specialist skills in IT alongside humanities such as English, social sciences such as psychology, languages, whichever the language of the country is, packaging, design, graphics. So, as a result, the teams of people bring in different disciplinary expertises, and because they bring in different expertises, it is not a simple A equals B relationship. It is far more complex, and because of the different disciplines, it means that all these people have to work in a team for a common cause. There is available from Australian Aid or AusAid a good practice guide to interventions and design of interventions of ICT driven projects in developing countries. There are a set of 10 questions asked here. Each of these questions, if addressed at the beginning when a project is being planned, will help us get a lot of clarity on whether a project should be done, should not be done, and what is the objective of the project, and who is going to be the specified target group. How, in what form of ICT are we going to deploy, which is going to be appropriate in terms of cost, support, maintenance, and compatibility with existing flows of information. Is the form of ICT to be deployed scalable? That means, can we build it up from a village to a larger community, counting in the not just a few thousands, but hundreds of thousands and millions of people? Are appropriate intermediaries in the field being used? Are there people on the ground to help us? What scope is there for public-private partnerships? Is it all to be done by one agency, or are there different people who will be providing their skills, providing their company's expertise to it? Is the content transmitted by the ICT relevant to the audience and in a language clearly, easily understood? Is the project itself self-sustaining, and if so, over what period? Is it a project only for 3 years, or is it a project that will give us a larger time space? And when the project funding is over, how will it sustain itself? What kind of monitoring have we put in place? What kind of performance measurement are we looking at when we try to understand whether it has failed or succeeded? And finally, what are the risks? What unexpected events or situations might arrive that will impact upon our project? And what should we do to manage these unexpected risks or situations that might occur? Answering these questions upfront very often will give us an understanding of, first of all, whether we should do a project or not, and if we should do a project, how it should be planned, and what are the key elements that it should include. So, when we look at this good practice guide, it is necessary to link our project to answer the questions, these 10 questions that are listed here. At the beginning, among the first things that we discuss in this section 3 is in chapter 7, which looks at the issues in project management. As already said earlier in section 2, and also just now when we talked about the good practice guide, initiatives must be very explicit or clear about their development goals and how they will impact upon the beneficiaries. How will, for example, the last village household benefit? ICTD interventions, because they are very expensive, should be demand driven rather than supply driven. It means they should not be top down, but it should emerge from a demand existing in a community. ICTD solutions should be sensitive to local conditions and limitations. Don't use technologies that don't exist in a community. Use what is available. We must understand what is available by way of technology and what is available in terms of the cultural conditions and context that exist. ICT solution should be sustainable and designed to last in the toughest of conditions. Heat, dust, weather, rain, plus lack of electricity, plus lack of technical people to maintain. Therefore, solutions should be sustainable. They must be designed to last in tough conditions. As important is strong political government support for a program. In the absence of support from government, funding, management and other issues emerge. These must be addressed. Process driven as opposed to duration specific or target driven. The process of using ICTD is a process of learning for many one of us, and as we engage with ICTD interventions, if we are bound by time or simply by numbers, we may not achieve the targets or we may not achieve the objectives that we had intended. Therefore, look at processes of decision making, processes of choice of technology, processes of implementation, rather than doing something by a specific date because the funding ends or because numbers have to be addressed. Users, that is, the beneficiaries, and not the content producer or the delivery agency, usually determines the extent and nature of the benefit derived. All along I have been saying, whether in section 1 or in section 2, that it is the ultimate user, and without the ultimate user, if we do not look at that user, the receiver of the services, who is an active participant in the process, we will never be able to deliver a successful project. There has always been a debate as to whether policy comes first or governance comes first or projects come first. In many countries, because technology has moved very quickly, there are applications and projects which have shown the way for policy. In other countries, without a policy, you cannot have a project. This is like the chicken and the egg question, but whatever it is important at one point or another to have both policy and governance mechanisms in place. In the Asia Pacific region, many countries already have a development policy in place. If you will look in your text, we have referred to the development policy in Afghanistan. We have also referred to the development policy in other countries. So, we have a development policy in place in most of the countries. Many Asia Pacific countries also have an IT policy in place, a policy which defines the role that information and technology will have. But as with the diversity of the region, the thrust of the policy differs from one country to another, depending on each country's requirements and concern. Some may look at an IT policy in terms of building up capacity, another may look at an IT policy in terms of building infrastructure or the information highway consisting of telecommunication towers. Still another country may look at using IT only in government. The point, however, is that an ICTD policy and framework for action is different from an IT policy. And an ICTD policy articulates the perspective and the plan of action desired by the government for deploying ICTs to achieve goals. In the Asia Pacific region, countries that have had a clear ICTD policy have very often succeeded in a large number of projects. There are examples given in the textbook, but one would look, for example, at what the ICT for development policy of China, Philippines, India or Singapore are to understand the way in which they have deployed technology to address development goals. Look at these examples and see what you find. When we begin to look at projects and the project management process, like all development projects, ICTD project management also moves in a project cycle. The project cycle begins actually with planning, that is the beginning of the intervention, where many maps are laid out and many blueprints are laid out of how the project should be. The execution or the implementation of the project, monitoring, that is ongoing evaluation and review to see whether we are succeeding, and after that a summative or an end evaluation to see whether the project has achieved its intended objectives, and then the closing of a project, which then feeds into programming of a fresh one. So, the project management cycle, which is there in almost all interventions in the development sector, it is also there in all interventions in business and other sectors. But in the ICTD, it is important because we are spending huge amounts of money and huge amount of effort to achieve what seems to be an elusive development goal. So, let us look a little more in detail about the different parts of the project management cycle. In the first stage, we have what we call initiation, that is the project anchored in a goal consistent with a strategic vision of a development program? Is the project itself, is it strategic itself to impact change? Will it bring about change? It must be clear how the project contributes to the goals and objectives of a national program. After this is determined, the next stage is to do a feasibility study. In the feasibility study stage of the planning process in the beginning, the feasibility study should address the questions: does the project conform to development and environmental objectives and priorities of a particular country or region? Is it technically and scientifically sound? Is this the best methodology among available alternatives? Is this the best way to deliver a project? Is it administratively manageable? Is it demand driven, and are the project outputs going to be in demand? Is it financially justifiable and feasible? Can we spend this kind of money on it? Is it compatible with the customs and traditions of the people? And is it likely to be sustained beyond the intervention period? These are the questions that must be answered in a feasibility study. Having done this, we move on to what is known as a stakeholder analysis. The stakeholder analysis answers the following questions. For instance, who are the stakeholders in this project? What are their potential roles? Are they influencers, sponsors, users or champions? What are their problems? What are their needs in relation to the project idea? What could be the expectations or interests of respective stakeholders regarding this project? What are the weaknesses or constraints of each stakeholder? And what could be the potential contribution that each stakeholder makes to a project? Having done this, we also look at what are the consequences of their contribution. Try to answer these questions whenever a project is designed. As once we have done the planning in terms of the answering the initial questions, and we have done the feasibility study, we move on to actually planning the intervention itself and developing a blueprint for the project. In this case, developing the blueprint will actually entail developing the project scope, what is included, what is excluded, and then it will also include timelines and the tools in which to manage time. For instance, there are many timeline charts available in the open source software domain. Among these is the Gantt chart, a sample of what has been provided to you in the text for you to look at. Okay. As we do a schedule of time and tasks to manage a project, we list the activities and tasks in the work plan along with who is going to do them. We make an assessment of the risks in terms of what are the unexpected situations that might emerge and how we will address them. We make a list of the project resources and see what we have and adjust these financial and human to the planning of a project. We look at project costs and the way in which money has to be distributed over the time and in what way in terms of a project that is to be executed. Having made this complete blueprint, the actual task of implementing a project takes place. In this is much more a question of how we may manage the leadership or the human resources in a project. We must have a project leader and we must have a project team and a management office. Sometimes you might want to create a project management unit within your department which specifically pays attention to this one intervention. And we must also take into account all the project stakeholders and their role while we are implementing the project in a continuous manner. So we must always take them on board at our meetings in a continuous stage of discussion so that we can make the kind of mid-course corrections that are required. But more than anything else, the introduction of ICTs into the development process is not simply about introducing technology. It actually implies a major reform of a change of a system or a government, because we are asking people to change the process, attitudes and styles of management. So these are challenges that need to be addressed are the processes. For example, moving from a manual process to an automated one. Attitude changes, moving from an older way of doing things, easier way, to a much more demand driven. And the ways of management that go from top down management to a much more of teamwork and collaboration. This is not easy, and projects that have succeeded is because they have paid attention to the change management process. As much as change management is important, so also are partnerships. ICTD needs a grand alliance of different stakeholders working for a common cause. On the one hand, if the end users, if the villagers, if the community feels a sense of ownership and has developed capacity or is helped to develop the capacity locally to take ownership of the ICTD intervention, then we will invariably find that a project will succeed. We also need to ensure that there is an engagement of the citizens or the users, and we also need to ensure that we are accountable to them in terms of social accountability. The issue about partnerships in ICTD projects is not only that they have to be built, but they have to be nurtured and they have to be sustained. There are many ways of building partnerships. We have to build a common shared vision that continues over time in order to successfully implement a project. Therefore, partnerships are very important and we have to follow them up. Partnership building needs a shared vision, clearly defined roles and responsibilities, accountability for the roles, transparency, ownership and ethical frameworks. Partnership implementation needs to address organizational structures and expectations, change management, leadership, teamwork, communication and trust. Successful partnerships also require an awareness and understanding of the partnership environment and are sensitive to local contexts and financial sustainability. All of this seems in theory to be very, very simple, but in actual real situations, building partnerships may be the toughest part of managing any kind of an intervention, because there are always conflicting interests, there are always conflicting territories, and we have to manage with people who have different needs, different skills, different abilities, and different perspectives of how a project should be done. So, without effective partnerships, we cannot run ICTD interventions. To summarize, the points that we must remember is that although ICTD projects is like managing other types of development projects and we follow the same project management cycle, we are different because some terminologies differ and because ICTD interventions must pay particular attention to managing change. Viewpoints of stakeholders must be taken into account. Their full participation in the process must be encouraged and ensured. Users must particularly be involved from day one of the project. Any ICTD project requires the efficient and effective delivery of services, and this therefore means we must look at disciplines, resources, people, scope, time and cost, and in a sense business process engineering. And a careful review of the unit and of the organization systems must be undertaken so that it can be modified to address the objectives of a project. Take a look at this practical exercise where a local government has developed a web portal. Examine the web portal in terms of the various ICTD project issues discussed so far. Make a list of suggestions you would give to the local government and a list of suggestions why it should be shut down or recreated. Form two groups. One will discuss improvements, other will discuss the closure. Defend your choices in an open debate.